Which political system performs better with regards to its foreign policy? A free democratic regime, or a totalitarian or an authoritarian one? People would naturally gravitate to a democratic free system any time of the day. But a political analyst should be fair and pragmatic about assessing how the political system of a nation in real life affects their standing among world nations. In history, we have good examples of both regimes succeeding and failing in their foreign policies, in their ability in standing up against their enemies or adversaries. The Roman Republic from the ancient world is a very good example of a democratically elected political system who stood up against its enemies, beating away, even devouring all its adversaries, eventually turning into a huge behemoth that controlled the Mediterranean world. And then, of course, there was the lesser dignified League of Athens and the Greek cities. However, totalitarian or authoritarian regimes have far numerous stories of success, starting from the regional ancient Egyptian kingdoms to the great Persian Empire in its various phases, and then, of course, the metamorphosis of the Roman Republic into the dictatorship of the Roman Empire, which was the greatest ancient empire ruling over the Mediterranean. Rome in its imperial phase was even greater and more feared than it was in its republican phase. Modern history, of course, brings much brighter examples of democratic nations standing up against their enemies, their power and influence spreading across the world. The most prominent example is the British Empire, whose possessions spanned the entire planet, holding a fourth of the world's land mass. And then, of course, the United States in our modern days. Nonetheless, totalitarian regimes in the modern era have also proved their ability in projecting their might outside their borders. Russia is a great example, starting with the Tsardom, then its Soviet Union phase, all the way to Vladimir Putin's contemporary Russia. And then there is, of course, China, the great behemoth on the world stage, set to dominate financially and economically, not only in Asia, but the world over. A huge part of China's world supremacy actually is due to its successful, finely tuned totalitarian regime, which has been dominated by powerful figures who have skillfully kick-started the Chinese economy starting in the early 80s, all the way to this point in time. Chinese manufacturing and technological prowess has skyrocketed during the past 2 decades, with China becoming the world's factory, contributing 25% of the whole world's manufacturing power. Thanks to its economic boom, China has risen from just being a shameful spot of backwardness, lamenting over its glorious history and heritage, into a grand, proud superpower, expanding its influence and prestige not just in Asia, but all around the world, in Africa and South America, even in Europe itself. Usually these systems, the totalitarian or the democratic regimes, conduct themselves on the world stage by employing the same toolset, differing only in the way the leadership in both systems think and act. In today's episode, I'll try to tackle the idea of how the regimes from these opposite sides of the political spectrum managed their foreign affairs. by discussing a short series of interviews published on the History Today magazine, in which 4 historians were asked about the impact of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Day of Infamy, as Roosevelt has called it. The occasion being, of course, the 80th anniversary of the event. The historians were asked whether the Japanese attack on the United States naval base in Hawaii turned out to be the deciding factor in the defeat of the Axis powers in Europe. Not that it only drew the United States into fighting Japan, but also brought its troops to Europe, thus sealing an Allied victory on the old continent. The 4 historians gave good, nifty answers, though not all of them directly engaged with the question itself. I'll leave the link to interviews in the comments section for those who'd like to read it for some nice tidbits. The opinions intrigued me and made me think about how the leadership in Japan and Germany handled their foreign relations during the war, especially regarding the engagement of the United States. Both, of course, were authoritarian regimes. By 1941, the Germans had their fortunes going downhill after glorious victories in 1939 and 1940, culminating in the occupation of France. However, they failed to invade Britain, and then their military advances came to a halt in North Africa, at Egypt's western borders at Alamein. They went on invading the Soviet Union, but their blitzkrieg pace was also slowing down. The Germans wanted to give it another push to finish their engagements at every battlefield. One major hurdle appeared to be the United States. They were infuriated by the Roosevelt administration's help to Britain and the trickling of aid and armament to the Soviet Union. Early on, Hitler wanted to remove the US and its huge industrial component out of the equation. On the other side of the world, Japan too was annoyed by the US constant diplomatic pressure regarding its invasion of China and its increasing support of the Chinese. Like the Germans, Japan wanted the US to give up on Asia completely. There was lots of disagreement in the upper echelons of the Japanese establishment regarding the best way to deal with the United States. The 3 main parties were the Navy, the Army, and the civil components of the Japanese government. The latter part of the government was dominated by foreign policy experts and officials educated abroad, having greater involvement with diplomats and officials from the West. They didn't want Japan to be involved in a war against the United States. Some of them had finished their education there, and of course they recognized the United States as the great powerhouse that it was. And then there was the army, whose leadership saw that the Japanese efforts should be directed towards the invasion of China and preparation for another confrontation with the Russians, now the Soviet Union, their major regional adversary. Also focusing on the Soviet Union would definitely help the Germans, the Japanese attacking from the east, while the Germans continue hammering the Soviets from the west. However, the leadership of the Japanese Navy proved to be Japan's undoing. They were angry for having their war contribution greatly eroded after the Naval Treaty of London in 1930, which limited the role of the Navy in modern wars. The leaders in the Japanese Navy recommended knocking the US early, and it was their viewpoint that finally prevailed. Their few hours of glory in Honolulu at Pearl Harbor would prove to be the harbinger of the demise of the Japanese Empire itself. The Japanese thought that the attack would shock the United States into begging for peace negotiations, because in a democratic system, it would be difficult to turn the whole economy to war efforts on short notice. That would prove to be a hugely short-sighted assessment of the American system and sentiment, and the democratic system in general. The Japanese had hugely discounted the possibility that an attack on American soil would unite the Americans against them. More interestingly, some historians see that it was also Hitler's grievous fault to declare war on the United States 4 days after the attack, on December 11, 1941, followed of course by Italy, that was at that point starting to look like a German puppet state. Declaring war on the United States was a rash and unnecessary step. Hitler thought that he would preempt the United States' preparation for war against Japan and later Germany by directly engaging it on both fronts, the Pacific and the Atlantic, exhausting its current troops and crippling its rearmament efforts. But that was a short-sighted decision as well, because Hitler and his regime failed to calculate the enormous industrial capacity of the United States that would soon power what would become the biggest war machine in world's history. Some historians believe that the Nazi decision was even worse than that of the Japanese. The Japanese gamble was a direct attack on American soil that unified all American politicians with widely varying perspectives, all the way to the public who were averse to war. Due to this egregious attack, the Americans were intent on focusing their efforts against Japan to make them pay for the Pearl Harbor attack. Actually, all US assistance to the European allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, were halted immediately. Public opinion wasn't as much interested in fighting Nazi Germany. That was, of course, Japan's ally. A majority of the Americans still thought that they had nothing to do with the war in Europe. But that sentiment changed 4 days later when Hitler declared war on the United States. Now the Americans had to contend with the seemingly impossible premise, conducting a war in Europe and another in Asia. Hitler thought that the US would balk at that possibility and seek peace negotiations with the Axis powers. But of course, that didn't happen. The consequences of the actions of the Japanese and the Germans would consequently convert two separate continental wars into a sprawling world war that would eventually decimate both Germany and Japan. And of course give rise to the American army, the greatest militarized force in world history, and the Soviet Union, which would also become a great superpower for the remainder of its life. So while this story may portray totalitarian regimes as deficient in their abilities to evaluate and counteract their adversaries, I think it's the other way around. Actually, totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, under perceptive, resourceful leaders, could punch way above their weight. And that's because dictators can more easily rally their nations without fear of widespread public protestation or antagonism by any political party within the country that could derail their plans. They can also rally their people much faster than in democratic nations. For example, had Japan not attacked Pearl Harbor and had Germany not declared war on the United States, Roosevelt would have had a hard time mobilizing the entire US into the war. That wasn't the case with Hitler, and definitely wouldn't have been the case with Stalin, nor with Putin or Xi Jinping. However, the totalitarian regimes would always be deficient in their strategic thinking and management due to the lack of fearless input and the lack of criticism and revision. Because when Hitler and the Japanese leadership were proven to be wrong, no one could point out their failed strategies and defective planning. Because cadres within these systems did not challenge their leadership. On the other hand, in democratic nations, leaders who make bad decisions are given advice more easily by their advisors. And if they refuse advice or they lack brave or resourceful advisors, they are criticized, even lampooned by opposing politicians, the news outlets, and the media outlets at large. The potential for revision is really one huge advantage of democracies over dictatorships. Being a democracy or a dictatorship definitely shapes the way nations conduct their foreign policy, but it's way more complicated than a simple advantage point here or there. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any opinions or feedback, kindly leave it in the comments section on Facebook or YouTube. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.